Hey, welcome back to Garbeardia. Back with you with chapter 16 of the Veil Riders. A long time coming, and I am sorry for how long it took. I ain't perfect, ain't no one perfect, but just like you guys, I'm just trying to do my best. But here we go, here it comes. Enjoy the story. Chapter 16. The ride back to Valhalla Hill was a stressful time for Fino. The number of Veil Riders in his bubble grew from just Yule to now the vehicle being full of them, as well as riding on top to avoid walking. To say that he was drenched in nervous sweat by the time they reached the first checkpoint to the base was an understatement, and he kept having to keep his voice in check to sound as feminine as possible. Mullen and Yule chatted to each other the entire time Yule drove, and the man kept throwing his thumb back towards Fino, in which Mullen would look over his shoulder and give Fino suspicious looks. Or more accurately, gave Fino's ear tips and eyebrows looks, as the southern elf was not all that keen to lock eyes with the human, and barely bucked his head above the rim of the hatch. While Yule was known, Mullen was not, and the fact he walked away from that artillery strike meant he was probably as tough and mad. The checkpoint, staffed by Valley Elves, saluted Yule smartly and pushed open the swing gate that had been constructed by the Dwarven Engineer Corps. One of the Harpy messenger runners was sent up to the main base to get the medical company rousted and ready to receive wounded, as healing potions were hard to come by in the field and a lot of the auxiliaries had infected wounds that would need immediate tending to. Yule was whistling happily as he drove the captured paladin up to the main parade of Valhalla Hill, noticing the entire way that buildings had seemed to triple since his foray into the field. Not only had they constructed long barracks buildings all set in tidy rows on the back side of the hill, but a proper stables had been built as well, along with any other building a base could possibly need. There was even a huge rough wooden tavern, of which soldiers were piling out of to cheer and wave at the survivors of the artillery ambush. As the paladin came to a stop in front of the now expanded command bunker, Yule could see Yethis wringing her hands in front of almost 40 medical personnel, many of whom were bearing stretchers for those who could not walk. Yule's boots had barely hit the ground before Yethis drove herself into him with a hug, standing back and running a finger down his facial scar. "What in heavens did you do?" Yule shrugged, pressing the top of his patrol cap and the amulet with what little remaining blood it had to his scalp. "Got blown through a building." "What?" Yethis yelled, and began aggressively inspecting Yule's ears for brain leakage, who fought back by leaning backwards. "Whoa, hey, calm down, I'm alive. Relax. You can check me out later. Go make sure no one else dies." Yethis made to argue, but the look from Yule made her choose otherwise, moving off to start tending to the wounded being hauled out of the paladin gun deck. Chickly came running out of the command bunker and was next to slam into Yule, hugging him tightly as Piper walked out behind him, giving a sly whistle to the impressive artillery vehicle. "The dwarves will like this one." "They better. Cost me quite a few joes to get it." Piper looked to the rear of the paladin where wounded were being offloaded, and then to the tired-looking foot troop that had walked behind the vehicle the entire way. "How many?" "Well, I set out with a small company, if you remember." Yule shrugged off his chest rig and set it down on the ground, in which his breast pockets were finally exposed. He pulled out 3 thick stacks of auxiliary patches tied with twine and held them in his hands, looking down at them solemnly. "I believe I had maybe 2 platoons left. Only Terrans that made it out were Mullen and I. They brought their shells right onto their own troopers and dragged it across the town towards us. Obliterated the town and wiped us out." Piper twitched his eyebrows up in shock, but his face remained impassive as he reached out, taking a stack of the patches from Yule's hands. "Seems we humans grow ever thinner as every day passes." "Quite," Yule said dryly, and asked Piper for what all had gone on. Piper was candid, and told him that the Czechs were harassing chosen children units up and down their lines, while Domino and another NCO had taken the less green auxiliaries out to harass Sanrion. The dwarves having taken a small complement of mortars to shell the picket lines outside of the city. They are heavily dug in there, like ticks as you would say, so Domino is making sure they do not get much sleep. Sounds like a job he would enjoy doing. Piper went on to explain that Domino had allowed the dwarves to dig in along a tree line that was just within range of the city, and a small cop had been set up, allowing them defensive abilities while pelting the city with mortar fire. The dwarves had also figured out how to make a bazooka of sorts after a training incident in an engineer hold, where a drunken dwarf had had a hold my ale moment. It gave them a light bulb spark, and after a short round of tests, the Belcher had been born, named after the dwarf who had barely survived the encounter with the mortar. They have been quite good in testing. Gremlin told them about the Panzerschreck and, well, Yule gave a small chuckle. What's next? Panther tanks? Piper didn't laugh with him, and Yule blinked a few times. Piper, you're not serious, are you? They were quite smitten by the idea of a Hetzer as well, I'm afraid. But they don't even know how to build them. They don't have the industry for making tanks. Piper pulled a hand-rolled root cigarette from his pocket and tilted his head slightly as he spoke, rolling the patches around in his hand. Well, Gribben has a lot of information on those laptops of hers. She may have shared too much. Christ alive and knitting, Yule growled, and Piper laughed. It was not the fact she gave out the information, but the fact she might have given it out for free that made Yule angry. Money made from selling technology was the linchpin in keeping his troopers going, and that was a lot of money that may have slipped from his fingers. Yule then remembered Chickly was still attached to him, and he patted the harpy's back. Keeping everyone in line, Chick? Always, Chickly said with a laugh, and finally let him go. Builders made Bunker bigger. Chickly even has room inside. They made Yule's room bigger, too. Piper puffed a bit of smoke out from his mouth, gesturing with his cigarette. And they made your room bigger, that also happened. In fact, we all got rooms now. They even made barracks for the troopers. Well, I'll look at that whenever I have time. Chickly, could you grab the engineer and bring him here? Chickly flapped off without delay, and soon a heavily armored dwarf was rolling up the road in a gator. Naturally, he was ecstatic at the opportunity to buy and study the Paladin. Under the conditions, he didn't take the entire thing apart. And soon a small shipment of coinage would be hitting Yule's coffers. Additionally, Yule brought forward Pheno, dragging him up from the vehicle to explain how the Paladin worked. Pheno, while explaining what he could to the excited dwarf, began to notice a lot of the Veil Riders were beginning to gather around, wondering just as to why a chosen child was in Valhalla Hill and not in chains. Pheno was able to talk at length for about 10 minutes before a brim touch finally broke the ice, pointing at the much shorter Pheno. Why is a southern elf here? He should be locked up with the other mad one that keeps trying to escape. Yule turned his head slightly to look at the brim-touched, who shrank a little as Yule's eyes bore into his own. This is Pheno. Her sister was killed when the Chosen Children Command shelled their own in order to get to us. She's as much as a victim as anyone else. An Oni female specialist began to slowly smile, looking back and forth from Pheno to Yule. Commander, why are you calling him a she? Pheno began to almost vibrate as terror shot up and down his nerves, and he turned around from the dwarf, who was writing down something in his journal, and looked up at Yule, who had now turned completely towards the Oni. Private Yuriko, what are you on about? Chickly also stepped forward, tapping his small claws together. The Oni is right. This is male chosen child. The Oni gestured towards Chickly, who gestured towards Pheno, who was looking as if he was going to faint at the drop of a hat. Wait, hold on now. Goliath stepped forward, his giant fingers twirling his mustache in thought. Ears are longer and more pointed at the tips. High angle. He's a bit scrawny, but that's definitely a male. Specialist Yuriko stepped forward, crackling her knuckles. If he ain't gonna confess, I know a surefire way to solve this mystery. Pheno shrunk away from her and backed into Yule, causing him to spin around and look up at the human. He was sweating hard enough that it was like he was hugging the sun, and his dirty, ragged uniform was sticking to his skin like a wet bedsheet. Yule placed his hands on his hips and cocked his head at the southern elf, his scarred face one of confusion. Pheno, if you were a man, why didn't you tell me? I've been calling you ma'am the entire time and you never corrected me. Fino's ears drooped slightly from how strangely hurt Yule's voice sounded, and he brought his hands up together as if asking for forgiveness. Mr. Yule, I'm sorry. It was a strange night. I was about to be shot, and then the monster from the reports I've been reading suddenly lurched out of the darkness and snuffed out my accusers like a wraith. I had read you're more lenient with female prisoners. You already assumed I was female, so I just rolled with it in the hopes you'd be less likely to kill me in the end. Yule moved his jaw from one side to the other, rolling it in thought, and the muscles popped quietly. He looked down at Fino as a bead of sweat dripped from the elf's chin, and sighed. That's the reputation that precedes me? I mean... Fino looked at the Veil Riders who stood around him, and rubbed his right shoulder awkwardly. Yule looked up at the clouds, gave another sigh, then nudged Fino. Look, your sister was killed in cold blood along with my troopers. You're a victim here, not an enemy. He sucked in some air and began speaking louder, addressing the troopers that had amassed around him. This elf, Fino, is as much a victim as anyone. Just as I had stated, and his sister was killed by his command. Then, after digging as to why, they were going to shoot him the very night I arrived. Fino is not an enemy. Fino is a friend and my guest. Treat him as such. When Yule said the last him, he slapped Fino on the shoulder, and the elf had to stifle a panicked screech. Chickily bared his fangs at Fino in an aggressive smile. Sissy elf. Chickily, come on now. What did I just say? If harness fits. Yule scooped up Chickily in a headlock and gave him a playful noogie while dragging him away. Why can't you play nice with the other kids? Fino, finish up with the master engineer, then meet me back at the command bunker. Fino stood there, gaping at Yule as he walked away, and the rest of his troopers followed suit, walking behind him while laughing sporadically at Fino. So about this giant gun, began the dwarf, and Fino turned around, shaking himself mentally and wiping the sweat from his forehead with his dirty sleeve. Right, works off of a two-part charge. First you load the main shell. Yule spent a little bit of time with Chickily, letting the harpy tell him all the scuttlebutt and small rumblings that he had heard while around the base and out on aerial patrol. While Yule was away, it seemed that Severus had gotten impatient with Yule and had instead begun going after his NCOs. Much to her annoyance, only Domino seemed to be game for taking her on, and even the Harpy Queen found him to almost be too much to bear. Not that Yule was complaining, as he had no love to spare for the particular harpy, and wished she would stay away from him for as many wingspans as he could put between them. With Domino heading out to the field, Severus and a small contingent had followed them out, now acting as runners and scouts for the COP that was created by the edge of the Sandrion Woods. Besides that, the Terrans were drilling every new recruit they could get their hands on into a soldier, and some grasped the concept far faster than others. Goliaths had begun showing up in larger numbers, however, they were slower at adapting to new ideas and technology. The dwarves and elves, however, were the exact opposite, digesting any information they could get their hands on and spinning it to their own devices. Supplies from the engineering holds were coming in on long wagon trains, keeping ammunition and weapons flowing in a steady stream. The Oni and Brimtouched were able to break ground on developing a rudimentary type of Kevlar, except unlike Earth, they were able to weave in special fabrics and blessed materials into the weaving, allowing it to be stronger and lighter than normal Terran Kevlar. Attached to the auxiliary plate carriers, again made by the Oni and Brimtouched, were classic elements of steel armor, just in case things came into close combat. To Yule, as he watched a small troop of patrolling auxiliaries walk by, the shoulder armor looked a lot like Lorica Segmentata, a classic Roman steel plate armor, except that the top plate was broader and came further down the shoulder. After watching them go by, he thought it didn't look too shabby, and the crazy lads had even painted camouflage designs on the steel so it wouldn't shine in the sun. After giving Chickly his fill of hugs and stories, the Harpy ran off to collect his NCOs and whatever other leadership still remained in the base. When all were gathered, he relayed what he had learned and what had happened the days after the shelling, omitting some parts such as the goddess coming down and ruining his perfectly good death. "Bradley's?" Cole asked, now sporting a locally made patrol cap and having gotten a fresh haircut from somewhere on base. "What kind of Bradleys we talking about here? Linebackers? M2A3s? Yule turned his hands, exposing his palms as he rested on an actual chair, cushioning and all. "I don't know. Fino didn't know much about it either. If things are still churning faster on that side of the veil, they could be pushing all kinds of things towards us. They're also expanding the veil opening somehow, which means they want to drag the real hardware through." Chicks shrugged. "I mean, those dwarves made a bazooka on accident and then morphed it into a Panzerschreck. We could probably gank most armor that comes through the veil." "Not armor I'm worried about." Yule leaned back, taking a small sip of tea from a canteen that Chickly had brought him. "If they get airborne elements in here, we could be staring down the barrel of an M230 with thermals." Chicks winced. "Ah, right. There is that." "What's that?" Chickly asked, who had walked in with a small cup of milk for Yule's tea. Chicks filled him in on what an Apache was and what it could do, but Chickly seemed unfazed. "What about throwing magnet mine on it? Have Harpy just fly under and slap it on the big metal bird?" Yule looked from Chickly to Chicks. Chicks gave a nervous chuckle. Well, Gremlin showed the dwarves. "Go get me Gremlin." Yule was furious, and it showed in his voice as much as it did on his face. Chickly didn't like how Yule looked when he was angry, and volunteered without delay to go fetch the female Terran. Yule could not believe just how much technology Gremlin had handed out for free, and the magnet mine, while not a perfect weapon, could have set up the Veil Riders for years alone. Yule dismissed his NCOs after asking them to write up reports on how many troops they had, supplies, and current movements in the field, then sat in front of the door in the now reeking leather chair. Yule had still not bathed since his arrival at Valhalla Hill, and the smell was almost turning the leather different colors. Gremlin poked her head through the door some minutes later, and the only thing to greet her was a looming figure of Yule, holding the metal canteen in his hand, and the rest of the command bunker personnel who were keeping as far away from the splash zone as possible. "Hey, Yule!" Gremlin cooed nervously, stepping past the door and shutting it behind her. "I heard you were back." "Uh-huh," Yule growled, and Gremlin could see his eyes were alight with rage. "So, Gremlin, I hear you are giving out free workshops on Terran tech." There was a small pause between the two, Gremlin shifting her feet nervously as she began to check where the closest window was. Well, I was talking with a few of the engineers. They gave me some pretty good beer. I may have gotten drunk and dived into this file saved on one of my laptops. Panther tanks? Magnetic mines, Gremlin." Yule's timbre was full of vexation. Gremlin held out her hand, the other pushing her black hair from her face. "I didn't show them the Salamander and ME-262 schematics, at least." Yule opened his eyes wide and shook his head in incredulity. "You have what on those laptops?" "Nothing." Gremlin gave Yule a chipper smile, while Yule wanted to take her laptops and make her surf on them. "Look. Stop giving away tech for free. We need those to make money and—" "Gremlin. Hey, Gremlin, I'm angry at you. Look over here." Yule snapped his fingers a few times in her sight line, but Gremlin was staring over the top of Yule's head at something behind him, and Yule twisted around in the chair, trying to follow what she was looking at. When he saw it, he screwed his eyes shut as if he was suddenly struck by head pain. For fuck's sakes. From the back of the command bunker's rear door, Fino had made his way in, having heard Yule shouting at someone and wanting to have nothing to do with it. However, instead of coming directly from the engineer, Fino had stopped by the bathhouse and also supply, getting a collection of clothes to wear. You'll judge that Fino must have spent the majority of his time in the bathhouse, as he had taken the time to not only wash his long hair but also braid it, dragging it over his shoulder much like Yeth's did. You'll realize now that Fino's hair was white, despite thinking it was brown, and judge it must have been from not being washed for a couple of days in rough wear. Where he had been keeping all the hair under his cap was a mystery, and judged it to be more elven trickery. With a bath and a wash, Fino looked more female than he had previously, and Yule still had no idea what the hell people were on about with the whole ear angle thing. If he had not been told, Yule still would have judged Fino to be a beautiful woman just from a glance. Who? Is that a southern elf? Yule turned to look at Gremlin, whose hands were resting on her cheeks. Despair coursed through Yule, remembering who Gremlin was and what kind of boards on 4chan she tended to frequent. Gremlin, this is Fino. He's the elf who helped us steal the paladin. He? Gremlin whispered, and a grin spread across her face. Gremlin? No. Gremlin, yes, she purred, and went to step forward before she stopped, her hands moving from her cheeks to her hair. I haven't done my hair, she mouthed, before turning and bolting out of the command bunker. Gremlin? Gremlin, we're not done here, Oh, God damn it. Yule stomped his boot as the door slammed shut, and Fino padded up behind him, wearing a pair of simple fiber sandals. The troopers working inside the command area all began to snort with quiet laughter, with Fino looking around in confusion. Who is that? Another headache. She also may try and eat you. Fino started, looking quickly from Yule to the door. What? Nothing. Found some clothes, did you? Fino gathered himself and looked down at his simple linen tunic and uniform pants. Well, shouldn't be walking around in my uniform, I would imagine, and they wouldn't give me a full set. Said I didn't deserve to wear the colors and only gave me the pants to be polite. Yule gave a snort and stood up from the chair, deciding he should probably hit the bathhouse as well before his ruined uniform began growing roots into his skin. For your safety, take a room in here, up near mine. Private, come here and show Fino to a free room, would you? A Valiel female private trotted over, giving Fino the stink eye but bowing slightly to Yule. Yes, sir. This way, you. Fino squinted at her as she refused to use his name, but didn't want to press his luck in regards to the more muscular Valiel punching him in the back of the head when making their way up the staircase to the living quarters. For now, he could deal with being called you if it meant prolonging his safety, even going as far as to not tell the engineer everything he knew just to make sure he saw the morning light of the following day. Yule watched the pair troop up the staircase, finished the canteen of tea, and made his own way to the bathhouse. If one were to make a judgment of his current hygiene status via smell, it would certainly be ranking somewhere in the neighborhood of dead animal and good cheese. The bathhouse was crafted with care from what Yule could tell, showing the hallmarks of seasoned builders and engineers. It was odd for him to see so much love and craft go into a place where people wash themselves, and found it to be very Roman in its way of thinking. If one thing has to be nice, let it be the bathhouse. Yule was happy to see it wasn't staffed by more than a few people on boiler duty, who walked back and forth checking on the towels and whatever else they were told to do in the place. Gremlin must have gotten her little crooked fingers in on this place too, as Yule told one of the privates to show him around. Not only was the water coming into the place via pipe systems, but there were also dwarf-crafted hot water heaters and boilers. These made it so the bathhouse had hot water on demand, coming in from a spigot and going right into the personal tubs or the group bathing area. The group bathing area didn't really do the small swimming pool justice, and Yule just knew that somehow Gremlin must have had some old Roman paintings on one of her laptops. There were even mosaics of tanks, mortars, rifles, and infantry running around the walls, and as Yule slowly turned on the spot, he realized that someone had taken the time to show the process of a normal citizen turning into a soldier by training in the fires of combat. The open bathhouse came to a crescendo on the far wall, where the Unicorn and M2 of the Veil Rider unit patch stood imposing above the tub, bristling with gold, silver, and precious gem accents. Yule sniffed as the steam began to make his nose run, and eyed the huge mural while scratching the scar on his face. Seems a bit overboard, but I wasn't exactly here to stop them. I think it's nice. Yule turned to see a male Oni private standing a few feet away, holding a towel that had a small bar of soap resting on it. You think so, Private Wakamiki? Private Wakamiki shrugged. Well, a blank wall would be a little boring. Yule tilted his head back a little and dropped his eyelids at the private, who coughed and tried to look somewhere else other than Yule. Very funny, smartass. He opted not to take part in the giant swimming pool of body soup, and instead went for one of the private tubs in the rear of the bathhouse. Here one could bathe in comfort, with only 4 other tubs sharing the room, having a total of 12 smaller tubs for those who wish to only sit in their own special flavor of body broth. Yule shooed Private Wakamiki away and hopped into a tub, just letting the hot water soak into his body and bones. He didn't think this through particularly well because he was in fact so filthy that the water had to be drained and refilled several times until he was able to finally soap himself. Yule was also startled to find that the bathhouse was co-ed, as around the 3rd time his bath needed drained, a female brim touch specialist had barged in with a tub scrubber and almost caused Yule to bash his face on the tile floor when he tried to scrabble back into the tub. What she saw, he had no idea, but she was smirking far too much for his own comfort. He stood grumpily in the corner, wrapped in a towel, as she emptied and scrubbed the sides of the tub. She only gave him a sly grin when she pulled down on the hot water lever to refill the tub and made her exit. It was not that Yule was ashamed of his appearance, but some things were better left to the imagination of those who he didn't share a bed with. His nerves cooled as he got down to getting clean, scrubbing down with the soap and a small cloth to get any other dirt too stubborn to come out with the regular water. In his hair, he found down near the roots to be mostly old dried blood, causing the water to pink slightly. But he was not in the mood for the brim touch to come back in and feast her eyes on more of his flesh. He had to admit, getting clean again was doing wonders for his mental exhaustion, but was also loosening up his forever tight muscles. Soreness seeped into his soul, and sleep was beckoning him as sweetly as death could, or Alavara, and he would take one or the other at this point. Private Wakamiki was standing outside with a fresh uniform of Yule's, assuming he had run off and gotten it from his room in the command bunker, and Yule slipped it on, wincing at the effort of having to move his achy and tired joints. When he made his way back across the parade grounds, and saluting a few of the auxiliaries that were running around and did it to him first, he found where his room was inside the command bunker. His little cozy corner, consisting of a rough field table, his rucksack, and a wool blanket, had gotten upgraded to a full room. A proper bed with a rifle rack next to it was in the corner, a small wooden wardrobe, a sofa chair, a couch, and a proper desk were all arranged within. Yule breathed in deep and smelled the scents of fresh carved wood, lacquer, cotton, and wool. He found them comforting and reminded him a lot of home. Someone had taken it upon themselves to unpack his rucksack and saw that almost all of his clothes were missing. "The hell?" he murmured, and turned his rucksack upside down. From the large opening a note fell out, bearing writing that he recognized as Yethus's. These smelled like death. Took to wash what could be, may burn the rest. Be back with food soon. Yule blew a drawn-out raspberry as he read, before tossing his ruck back into the little wardrobe. Annoying little shit. He sat down heavily on the sofa chair and breathed out, stretching out his feet and giving his toes a little wiggle. He was tired, dead tired, and he was curious how true that would hold. He had slept out in the woods before he found Pheno, but he was slightly worried that a full night's rest would send him back to the spirit world. Then again, even if it did, he had no doubts that the Grimm's little slice of pie would drag him back, kicking and screaming. He chuckled a little at the thought, closing his eyes, and heard a faint knock at the door. Open, Yule grunted, and he could hear the doorknob click open along with what he assumed to be the feet of a harpy. When the door fully opened, he saw Chickily standing in the portalway with a cup of tea in his other wing claw, and Yule couldn't help but chuckle. Yule cracked his eye open a little more. How many times did you spill that tea coming from the chow hall? Chickily walked forward, carefully balancing the cup with both hands once he closed the door and set it down on the small table near Yule. Chickily has broken 2 cups so far. Yule placed his hand over the mug, letting the warmth flow up into his palm. Not bad. Another voice rang out from the hallway, and Yule flicked his eyes fully open at Yethis' voice. He is not keen on asking for help. Yule turned his head a little more and saw the valley elf had managed to open the door silently after Chickily had closed it on her, and was bearing a small mess kit of bread, cheese, and sausage. I can get my own food, you know. I'm aware, Yethis chatted in Tunka, and set the mess kit down alongside Yule's tea. Yule was not sure why the gestures hit him as hard as they did, but he supposed that the exhaustion and trials of the time since his refunded death were starting to get to him. Chickily looked at Yethis in worry as Yule's face flashed with the emotion, but was quickly anacondaed by Yule's arm, dragging the harpy into him for a hug. He held out his other arm for Yethis, and found it quickly filled with the body of the elf who hugged him back fiercely. Thanks, Phyllis, Yule whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he fought to remain neutral-voiced, but the 2 in his arms just murmured back their replies, burying their faces into his chest. Yule sat in the sofa chair with both Chickily and Yethis curled up on him, their bodies pressed close to his, and he took their familiar smells into his nose. Chicklily's wild and windswept scent, the smell of Yethis' hair, and the curious twang of the healing salve she messed with lulled him to sleep, and he fell into the yielding black right then and there. No dream came for Yule, nor nightmare, and he instead had what many soldiers called the long blink, where one moment you are asleep and awake the next. Sunlight was filtering in through the windows as his eyes creaked open, and he noticed that there were still 2 lumps attached to his body. Chickily had somehow snuggled down beside him in the sofa chair and had buried his head under his arm, as if he were a chick snuggling into a mother hen, while Yethis had taken up the majority of his lap, her head resting just below his chin. Yule smiled, as it reminded him of his daughter back on Terra when they would fall asleep watching movies, and he reached over for the now cold cup of tea. As Chickily and Yethis continued to sleep, Yule took a moment to quench his thirst and get a little bit of food into his empty belly. When it became apparent the 2 were too far into the caressing arms of dreamland, he moved them both to his bed, throwing the top cover over them and taking off Yethis' boots. He looked down at the both of them, breathing softly as the morning sun warmed their faces, and he felt a pang in his chest. A pang of his old role as father, of husband, and he wrinkled his nose slightly at the memory. Outside his window, he heard the early morning crow of soldiers doing PT, of formations coming together and a cadence being called, and the thud of feet coming down as one on the march. Yule tucked his 2 sleepy chairmates into the sheet and put on a fresh uniform, figuring that if he was right, morning chow would be coming up soon, and it would be quite fun to give the new boots a good spook. And that's the end of chapter 16, I think. I may do a chapter 16 part 2. I have no idea. No one knows anything. We're all lost in the sauce here. But if you like this video and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Guardbeardia, as well as click the bell icon so you know when the videos are released through the week. If you really like the story, by all means donate to the coffee. At this point, the coffee's keeping this channel running more than YouTube is, because YouTube fucking hates my fucking guts. I cannot figure out why. But I also want to say I appreciate all of you who listen and all of you who subscribe, and especially those in the Discord who keep making my day just full of more smiles than it should be. But until I see you next time on this side of the veil, this has been Guardbro, and this has been Guardbeardia.
All those moments will be lost in time.